Well, I'm pretty sure I speak for everybody in saying that was a remarkable presentation for which we are all very grateful.
Thank you.
And I'd like to begin with a question, and the question would be, what was it that brought you to write this particular book?
It was a surprise to me that I wrote this book. I've written mostly about violence against women, and I have worked in Afghanistan since 2002, when I went to try to help women pick up the pieces. And I continued to work in Afghanistan. I still work in Afghanistan. And in 2010, the military got the idea of forming female engagement teams that were supposed to, the military thought that women must know a lot in the villages. And so they got the idea of forming these female teams to go out and win the hearts and minds of the women in the villages. And the women in the villages would then give them intelligence on the movements of the Taliban and so on. Well, you know, this plan was never going to work. But they were taking young women in the service who already had full-time jobs in the military on forward bases and assigning them this extra duty of going out on patrols to gather intelligence. So I, for the first time in 2010, embedded with the military. And of course, I already knew a lot about Afghanistan. More, I would say, than the colonel who was in charge of that base. But in any case, I went to see what was happening with these women soldiers. And there were only 6 of them, 6 women on a forward base with hundreds of men. And the first night I was there, I took my sleeping bag out of, and came out of my tent because the air conditioning was freezing me, came outside under the stars. And there I witnessed a very intimate scene that was life-changing for me. I had not liked the American soldiers I saw in Kabul, always going around in this kind of warrior strutting way and alienating everybody who they passed on the street. But as I sat under the stars in the dark, a soldier came out with a cell phone, and he didn't see me, and he made a call to someone and said, "I really need to talk to you." And then he couldn't speak. And I was made an unwilling witness to the disintegration of this man as he said, "I'm fine, I'll call you back." And then he slowly collapsed. And so after that, all the time I was on the base, I sat outside at night, and I realized he was not the only one, that there were many, many, many others. And on that base, every day, patrols were going out, and soldiers were coming back with men missing. And we never heard what happened to the missing men. And that's what gave me the idea. I want to know what's become of those guys. And it took me a year to get permission to embed in the medevac routes. But I did that and then just told the story of what I saw. I never would have dreamed this up on my own. It was that soldier that did it.
So the book's actually been out for a little while now.
A year.
It was about a year ago that you and I were last on a stage together, right, when the book came out?
Yes.
And so I guess I'm interested to know what kind of reaction you've gotten from your readers, and whether or not that reaction gives you any sense of things moving, of general attitudes changing.
I have to say, sadly, that I haven't received much mail from civilians. Most of my mail comes from military people, and it's of two kinds. Many soldiers currently serving in the military are very angry with me because I'm contributing to the stigma that they face in trying to reintegrate into civilian life. And
but let me interrupt. So they're not in a sense challenging the story. They just wish you weren't telling the story.
Yes, they just wish I would shut up. Because, and they have a point. I mean, it is true that the great majority of our soldiers come back and do fine. And they're afraid that they're going to be regarded as, you know, those crazy vets from Vietnam back again.
Right.
But those crazy vets from Vietnam are the ones who write to me and say, thanks. And they frequently say, to my surprise, that's just the way it is, because I had the impression that these wars are quite different in many fundamental ways from the war in Vietnam. But they're talking about some deeper things that are constant in all wars, I think.
That's very interesting to me because my experience is similar with my own writing in the sense that, and you know, some of my themes very much overlap with your themes. And I get a very considerable amount of email from either active duty people or veterans that tends to say, I understand what you're saying, keep saying it, but not nearly as much feedback, if that's what it is, from civilians. And actually, that actually gives me a certain amount of hope for change because it suggests, at least to me, that within the ranks there's an awareness that, you know what, this really hasn't gone the way it's supposed to go. And that therefore there is some need, a recognition of some need in the ranks, not so much in the general public, of that there's an imperative to think critically about our entire military experience. Now, can we talk a little bit about President Obama?
Sure.
In this sense, that I believe President Obama, when he became president, shared your concerns. He has said and has lamented that we have found ourselves engaged in permanent war. And he has, I think, attempted to disengage. And it seems pretty clear at this juncture that that attempt has failed. And I'm really pointing here to the ISIS campaign in particular as a resumption of the American-Iraq war. Do you have any thoughts on why, assuming that he has actually made an attempt to disengage from permanent war, on why that effort has failed?
Well, I think that I was troubled from the very beginning, even during the Obama campaign, by his feeling that the war in Afghanistan was somehow a good war, while the war in Iraq was a bad one. Right. I tend to think all wars are bad, and I feel that we never should have been in Afghanistan either. I mean, that war was as illegal from the point of view of international law as the one in Iraq, and also seems to have handed a victory to the terrorists in our knee-jerk response, doing just exactly what terrorists want you to do. So I think that while Obama was perhaps trying to think this through, once you say, well, this war is good and that one's not.
Well, let me speak up in the president's defense. I'm just playing the devil's advocate here.
Please do.
So my take,
Somebody needs to defend him.
My take would be that in running for the presidency, and he's running as the anti-Iraq war candidate, but as a Democrat, therefore vulnerable to being attacked as a national security wimp. We're now in the campaign. In order to protect himself from that charge, he needed to come out in favor of his good war. You know, I'm trying to get us out of Iraq, but trust me, I'm still a tough-minded guy. He gets elected, and indeed, he had his own surge, as you recall, in Afghanistan, announced in, was it December of 2009, but a surge that was time-limited and troop strength limited, and that frankly didn't go anywhere. And my sense is that by the time we get to the summer of 2010, which I think is, isn't it, no, or is it 2011 when General McChrystal gets fired? My sense is that by that time, the president himself recognized that the Afghanistan war wasn't winnable either. And that at that point, the unstated policy, maybe to some degree stated policy of the administration was, we're going to close all these wars down and we're going to find some way to, if not disengage from the Islamic world, at least lower our profile. That's my hypothesis. Events have defeated him, and the events in particular manifested by the rise of ISIS. So I just want to push you a little bit more on, can a president at this point disengage from these wars? Or are we so deeply embedded in a war for the greater Middle East, and all those institutions that you cited in your talk who benefit, are we in a sense just stuck? Is there any hope?
Well, the hope is that Obama can't be president after the next election. So he has nothing to lose by standing up for principle now. And you know, as Noam Chomsky says, the way to end terrorism is to stop participating in it ourselves. So we could, in theory, we could just stop, but it would take a leadership of great courage. But let me ask you a question, since you say that Obama sort of had to say he was going to do something.
Only from a political point of view.
Yes.
Political calculation. Political
calculation. But what is it about this country that a president must be tough? Why can't a Democratic candidate say, we don't want any part of any of these wars? Why does that have to be a political calculation?
My sense is that they are a prisoner of a specific reading of American political history. And the specific reading is one that posits, not necessarily accurately, that George McGovern was crucified back in 1972 because he came across as too dovish, and that experience repeated itself then in 1988 when George Herbert Walker Bush was able to paint Michael Dukakis with that same paintbrush.
Only because Michael Dukakis was out playing soldier in a tank.
Well, and the famous, the iconic photograph. But to further the narrative that the exceedingly talented and shrewd Democratic politician who then ran for the presidency in 1992, Bill Clinton, made a point of portraying himself as a hawk. And he won. And that therefore the conventional wisdom in political circles, I'm not trying to defend it, the conventional wisdom is, hey, if you want to have a shot at being the president, you need to subscribe to these notions. Now, looking forward to the next election, my hope would be that we would see Rand Paul make a serious run. I don't think he can get the nomination, but make a serious run for the nomination in the Republican Party. And somebody who you may not like, James Webb, make a serious run for the Democratic nomination. Again, I think there's very little chance that he could actually get the nomination. But the participation of both, they are both, I think, you could fairly describe them as either anti-interventionist or at least skeptical of interventionism. And if those two gentlemen could be heard in the run-up to the conventions, that could introduce a different note into the debate. I don't know if that'll happen, but that would be my hope.
Well, that is a very hopeful thing, but and you do in your own work make it very clear that individual characters do have influence on history, and so that the situation you describe is certainly plausible, but I worry more about the money.
No.
I worry about whether we can ever restore anything like a democracy.
I mean, could a Rand Paul or a James Webb, as anti-interventionists, raise enough money to become plausible candidates?
Yes.
That's a real good question.
Yes.
And I wouldn't bet my paycheck on it.
Yeah.
Could we talk a little bit about women and violence towards women? Which you mentioned in your presentation, and you actually write about it in the book to considerably in greater detail. And I would like to just get your thoughts on, I guess, on the broad question of women in the military. What's happened with regard to women from the institution's point of view? What's happened with regard to women in the military since the creation of the all-volunteer force? Well, first of all, there's a lot more of them. I think the force across the board is about 15%. When I was an officer, it wasn't anywhere near that. Restrictions on opportunities have been not entirely eliminated, but eliminated to a considerable degree. So whether it's good news or bad news, we now have women fighter pilots who are dropping precision-guided munitions on ISIS. Opportunities in terms of advancement have increased, so that we have 3- and 4-star female generals and admirals. And the services are very proud to trot these people out as a demonstration of the opportunity that's available to women. And yet, there still is clearly an epidemic of sexual abuse, sexual assault, that you write about it. And I would be interested in your thoughts on if all of this progress, and actually what you would do is progress, is true, why does the sexual assault problem not simply persist, but it could well be that it's actually becoming worse? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, well, with all due respect to the institution of which you were once a part, the military is a really kind of Neanderthal organization. It's the last bastion of patriarchy. Well, the church is up there too, of course. But they're up there together, you know. And of course, I start from a position of if you're going to have democracy, then you must absolutely begin with equality between men and women. Otherwise, whatever you have, you can't call it a democracy. And so as long as we need that equality, then that equality should permeate all of our institutions. But because the military retains that old boy attitude, even the training still uses all those old chants that are very misogynistic. There's indoctrination in misogyny all the way through. The chief recreation of the troops in the field, even in combat outposts, is watching pornography on their little, you know, electronic gear. And so that persists throughout. And
But is that, to what degree is that a military problem as opposed to a societal problem? In other words, to what degree?
This is a particular military problem because the underside of this that's much less publicized is that really the majority of sexual assault victims in the military are men. Because they so much outnumber the women. So the women's veterans organizations have gone to work to publicize this, and congresswomen have gotten behind it to publicize the sexual assaults on women. But the men are still silent. We don't hear from them, which tells us that this has been going on in the military forever. And why have men never spoken up about this before? And there are many cases that we know of now where the sexual harassment, often coupled with racial harassment in the military against men, has resulted in their taking their own lives in the field. And yet this still is not an issue for the Pentagon. I don't understand it.
One more question. What are you doing now? What are you working on next? What's the current project or the next project?
Well, this audience isn't going to believe this, but I don't like to write depressing books. So I took myself off for my R&R to Norway in order to write a book about how people can do things right. And I'm going to be writing about social democracy in Norway.
Yeah.
And in Scandinavia more generally. And the Scandinavian democracies all begin with gender equality because that's the oldest imbalance, the oldest prejudice in the world. And you've got to get rid of that one. We're almost down there, but not quite. And they're there in Scandinavia. So what they're able to do then in building a real social democracy for everyone should be the model of the world, despite the climate.
So next time we do this, we can do it in Oslo?
Sure.
Okay. Please join me in thanking Ann Jones. I think we can just walk out.